Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Weber. I'm the Associate Dean for Intellectual Life here at Boston University School of Law, where I'm also a professor. And I'm delighted to welcome you all here today as we celebrate our colleague and friend David Lyons' publication of his book, The Color Line, A Short Introduction. David is Professor of Law Emeritus here at the Law School. He was law alumni scholar, Professor of Philosophy, also at BU's College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. He joined the law faculty in 1995 after a more than 30-year career at Cornell. And his 8 books is, I don't know if this is, are we on number 9, David, or is this 8? 8 or 9 books include studies of utilitarianism and moral rights, the nature of law and legal interpretation, the work of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and the problem of confronting grave injustices in American law and political theory, as this book is clearly about. David has received major research fellowships with the Guggenheim Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, and he has also been a political activist since the 1940s. I know that I have enjoyed hearing some of his war stories from the early days of his activism, which has continued right up through until today, as he's helped organize a community-wide forums on behalf of the BU faculty for humane foreign policy and the Coalition for Social Justice. So it's an honor to gather here today to celebrate his new publication. I'm now going to turn things over to our colleague, Jack Bierman, who is Harry Elwood Warren Scholar and Professor of Law here at the Law School. Jack's scholarship focuses on 2 areas, civil rights litigation and administrative law, and I'm going to let him introduce our distinguished panelists and kick off the symposium. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you, David, and welcome to everyone who's here. It's a pleasure and a real honor to be moderating this panel. And my job basically is to introduce the panelists and get out of the way until it's time to facilitate question and answers. But I can't resist having the opportunity to say at least a couple words about what we're going to be talking about. And of course, this is in honor of the publication of David Lyons' book, The Color Line, A Short Introduction. And the published description of the book says it better than I can. So I'm just going to read a couple of very brief excerpt from the published description of the book, the published description, and then I'm going to say a couple of words and then introduce the panels. So here's from the description. The Color Line provides a concise history of the role of race and ethnicity in the United States from the early colonial period to the present, to reveal the public policies and private actions that have enabled racial subordination and the actors who have fought against it. Focusing on Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latino Americans, it explores how racial subordination has developed in the region, how it has been resisted and opposed, and how it has been sustained through independence, the abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, and subsequent reforms. Now, this is me now. I took this book to be sort of David's confessional testament to what deep down has been motivating him these last several decades. And I was struck by 2 things when reading the book. First of all, how much can be said in less than a dozen pages? And second, the violence. It seems that the spine of American society was constructed by unspeakable violence against people of color. Now, our first speaker today will be Professor Lisa Rivera, who joins us from University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she's Associate Professor of Philosophy. And speaking second will be Professor Paula Austin, who is Assistant Professor of History and African American Studies and Director of Graduate Studies right here at Boston University. And our third speaker is Professor Jasmine Gonzalez Rose, who made us all very happy by joining us this year as Professor of Law right here at the BU School of Law, where she is also Associate Director for Policy at the Center for Anti-Racist Research. Now, after they have spoken, Professor Lyons will respond to what I assume will be scathing critiques of his work. And then we will open up the floor to questions from the audience. And please submit written questions in the Q&A in the Zoom. Please be concise and precise. And we are not going to be using the raise hand feature. So just put your questions in the Q&A. And with that, Professor Rivera.
Gotta unmute myself. All right, so I wanted to start out with just a short caveat because this is the book of history and I have to consider the book as a philosopher. And there's an argument to make that philosophy struggles with history, particularly the Anglo-American tradition of philosophy. So I think one of the things I'd like to do is think about some of the ways it's essential or useful for philosophers, particularly American moral and political philosophers, or anyone who considers normative questions that arise in historical context, which all normative questions do. So I wanted to take a little tour back in time to some of David's early work and how a kind of thing of some of the ways that the complexity of history can distort political philosophy, or failure to look at the complexity of philosophy. So in 1998 paper, Moral Judgment, Historical Reality, Civil Disobedience, he reconsiders a standard theory that anyone engaging in civil disobedience must have a moral justification that overcomes the default political obligation to obey the law. And there's this view suppose that civil disobedience regard their system as reasonably just as they act to persuade other citizens in their democracy about specific unjust laws. And Lyons points out, for example, that the system of law under Jim Crow could never be regarded as reasonably just, and there is no political obligation to obey it. In fact, the lawbreakers during Jim Crow weren't those who resisted, but officials and their supporters employing unlawful methods against resistors and failing to arrest unlawful attacks on them, or to prosecute the perpetrators. Obviously, we know some people are just shot down in cold blood, right? So, and murdered in other ways. So, in considering why political philosophers got this question about civil disobedience so badly wrong, Lyons says, how could philosophers of goodwill have assumed that moral justification was required to disobey laws supporting chattel slavery, racist colonialism, or Jim Crow? If I am right in regarding that assumption as morally indefensible, then we must entertain the possibility of a systematic defect in the moral framework that obtained. The judgment of those who took political obligation for granted, despite the obvious existence of intolerable, deeply entrenched, systematic injustice against clearly identified groups within our society, was distorted by inadequate sensitivity to the palpable impact of the repression, especially on those of color. So the upshot of Lyons's paper is even stronger, because there's a failing on Rawls' part, for example, to acknowledge the specifics of resistance to slavery, colonialism, and Jim Crow, and thus mistakenly present a political practice as an ideal while divorcing it from paradigmatic practitioners that are the source of the ideal of civil disobedience in the first place, such as Thoreau, Gandhi, and King. So just to come back to this kind of, call it kind of like a sick burn, I guess, the systematic defect in the moral framework, right? So, I think that's worth looking at when you look at Lyons's book, whether there's a systematic defect in our moral framework or our political philosophy or our moral philosophy. And I think that's something that we have to be open to. And I think we're also more fortunate now to have some recent political philosophy that's substantially better informed about the history and reality of race and racism. But I hope to kind of nudge us a little bit to think a little bit about these racial dynamics of history. I mean, I'm hoping that will be one of the effects of people reading this book. And, there's always going to be this problem. There's this interesting philosophical question about what political philosophers do with history, because in a way, and in fact, history in the hope won't, but also be able to shape
Lisa,
their
Lisa, I hate to interrupt you. Lisa, you're breaking up, and I wonder if maybe you turn off your video, if that would help.
So sorry. Did you miss the last part? Should I restate it? Or people?
Yes, I think maybe the last couple of sentences.
Okay, so basically, I'm saying history is kind of in the background of political philosophy. And please interrupt me if I'm breaking up again. But, you know, and there's interesting ways that's true. You know, so in the Republic, we have the 30 tyrants kind of in the background. And in Hobbes, we have the English Civil War in the background. And we usually don't worry about the Republic or the Leviathan getting those facts right. But then when we get closer to our own time, you know, when we look at Locke's theory of property and what it owes to English colonialism, we see that maybe there are some ways in which failure to think about the historical background correctly can in fact be responsible for the implausible aspects of certain theories. And it's possible that we'll be able to see these better if we pay attention to accounts like David's account. You know, and so it's kind of the business of philosophy to generalize and be universal. But then there's also this problem where we're trying to be universal and timeless in our enterprise the way that Rawls was. And we may find that, you know, we're taking a bite out of the world, but we're also, the world can bite us back in a bit. So I guess I wanted to kind of preface this. You know, by thinking about what the color line is in David's book. That's a huge question. But I think it's really interesting because the way he describes it, he says, Americans generally see themselves and are seen by fellow Americans as white, black, red, yellow, or brown. These assignments are not primarily descriptive. They place Americans within a set of racial categories in which whiteness confers status and privilege. The color line, which is joined to the ideology and practice of white supremacy, is a founding pillar of American democracy. And then as you read the book, it's incredibly fascinating because, you know, one of the things I think is that maybe the argument would make us doubt whether America was a democracy for most of its history. And maybe David would agree with that since he agrees that Jim Crow wasn't fully, you know, wasn't a legitimate system. But there's something about the color line that's just, the book, the way the book uses the concept of the color line is very, very powerful. And it shows that the color line isn't just a pillar of our history, but it also might be like an agent of our history. Maybe in the same way that Hegel saw freedom as an agent of history, or Marx saw class conflict as an agent of history. Because in this vast sweep of American history that's covered, the color line establishes racial hierarchies, creates institutions that reinforce those. And it also is kind of like a substratum, a kind of ideological substratum that mediates most of the economic and social and political choices that brought us to our current society, economy, political system, personal status, and even our sense of ourselves. And so I just wanted to give kind of a short, like sort of general discussion of some of the ways that the color line isn't just like an original sin of our nation, but in a way almost like a kind of toxic soil that we're planted in, and we can't really get away from it. And I think David shows that everything in our social world is kind of imbued with this poison. And in fact, everything that we have now, in a way, kind of arises out of it. And so the first thing I think the color line does, I think one of the things that you have to recognize reading David's book is the color line isn't just, you can't just say the color line is something. You have to say it does things. The color line really does things. And it's kind of like a dynamic tool of oppression rather than a static barrier between people. And an interesting thing about the origin is that the color line functions right from the start as part of racial capitalism, but it isn't actually, it's very contingent and haphazard, as Dave describes it, in its early years, right? So the development of it wasn't inevitable, but it created a slave system in Virginia. Throughout the 17th century, it wasn't really codified until 1682, according to David. And one of the reasons David says that it happened the way that it did is possibly because color coding simplified enforcement. And then another thing that happened was that free African Americans left Virginia. So he's describing how the color line started in Virginia, just kind of it was obviously cropping up in other places. And then another explanation he gives is Bacon's Rebellion. So he says, consigning people to the bottom of the tidewater, to the bottom, the tidewater aristocracy accorded relative privilege, dignity, and opportunity to white persons who might be expected to defend their superior position by helping to maintain African American subordination. So that's one feature of it. A second feature of it is that a really interesting thing is that it tends to trump universalist thinking in terms of human equality and rights, even when such thinking is explicitly codified in policies or laws that appear as if they would protect those on the wrong side of it. So the ideology of racial supremacy, overcomes explicit de jure readings of the law by using a logic of exclusion perfectly tailored to promote white interests that you don't see in the law. And an example he gives there is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, where he talks about, he describes this one quote that says, "The utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their land and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. And in their property, rights, and liberty, they shall never be invaded or disturbed." And then finally, this is another feature of it is that most elements of the color line, as Dave describes it, are fundamentally in the service of economic relations, like property ownership and labor. And then fourth, the color line is incredibly flexible in David's description. So it adapts and it changes to benefit white economic interests. And even if those benefits are very unequal, the loyalty that it engenders from white Americans could be part of what makes it so intractable, even when its defense is very clearly inconsistent with recognizable moral ideals. So some people may only see a trickle of it, but they remain dependent on it. And I think that's a very important thing that we see. There's like a shift. It transforms from slavery to Jim Crow and convict leasing to the shift from a war on poverty to suddenly a war on crime, right? That was essentially a war on Black Americans. And then finally, I think this is also another relevant thing because people were saying it's very relevant. When we think about the current day, I think it's very interesting the way in which the color line is part of general attempts to restrict freedom across the board for people who disrupt aspects of it, right? Both in the form of coercive freedom limiting laws and in the use of violence. So it's very well defended from any disruption or dissent, including that of whites, even by white people. And the variety of tools at its disposal are very costly to resist for people. And, you see that in many different instances. One, of course, being the Tulsa riot that murdered so many people in Tulsa who had finally achieved a middle class existence, right? And I think I may be running out of time. I just wanted to make one point. There's a couple other points I had to make about how I think David's very wise to do the argument in a way that really reflects both Frederick Douglass's understanding of the color line, and also reflects Du Bois's understanding. And there's like a bunch of different ways he sort of, it keeps the similarity to them. One, of course, because he's so clear to point out wherever the color line operates as an ideology, which is both Douglass and Du Bois are very clear about. And the other thing he does, which I think is very useful, is his view is consistent with Du Bois's international approach, in which Du Bois sees the color line as both a world problem, right? He says the world problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And he also says that the color line is primarily for profit. He says, all through the world, this gospel is preaching. It has its literature, it has its priests, it has its secret propaganda, and above all, it pays, right? And so I think that same spirit is in David's work. And I think one of the things that maybe philosophers could gather from reading the book would be to move away somewhat from the individualism that characterizes a lot of normative philosophy, and also possibly to look at the problem of racism partly in the dynamic way that the color line allows, because in a way you want to know what to look for. And when people look for racism, often they look in the wrong place. And I think the way that David structures the function of the color line would actually be like a better guide for us sometimes to kind of look at where these like advantages and disadvantages are being played out. Okay, I'm done.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Rivera. Now our next speaker is Professor Austin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, David Weber, for asking me to participate in this symposium on Professor Lyons' book. And I am so excited to be in conversation with Lisa and Jasmine. Lisa, those were amazing comments. I wrote a lot of notes down. I have a lot of quotes. So I'm really happy to be in conversation with the both of you. And thank you, Professor Lyons, for asking me to engage with the book. So Professor Lyons and I met in my second semester here, which was also the first pandemic semester, at the Symposium on Restorative Justice and Societal Repair. I moderated a panel on, I think it was called What Might Restorative Justice and Society Repair Mean in the 21st Century, on which Professor Lyons presented. And I remember having a question, which is the question kind of where I end my comments. And so I'm looking forward to being able to have a conversation with everyone and with Professor Lyons about my final sort of question that is a big picture question. So so much of what Professor Lyons covers and references in the book are moments and historical trajectories that I am very familiar with, that I take my students through over the course of 15 weeks, because what the book does is to outline, trace, sort of zooms in certain places on the US's racial subjugation project in policy, in culture, in law. And because these were pieces that were so familiar to me, I spent much of my time reading the book, thinking about its pedagogical uses. And so some of what I want to talk about here are some of the incredibly useful things in the text. So as Lisa just outlined a little bit, the color line takes us from pre-contact North American colonization, that's the first chapter after the introduction, into the early 21st century, asking and briefly answering, and like so well done briefly, to Jack's early comment about how possible it is to say a lot in so few words, answering what I thought were really important questions about what the groundwork in white supremacist structures of racial capitalism and others, what that groundwork was that was laid in the colonial period, and then how those were reinforced and reinscribed in the following centuries. Some time is spent in each of the short chapters on the legal and what Professor Lyons calls the attitudinal bolsters to the U.S. racial hierarchy. And then some time is also spent on pushback and organizing against these manifestations. One of the things that I thought about when I was reading was all of the kind of relatively legitimate critiques of the 1619 project, of the New York Times 1619 project. One of those critiques that I think was legitimate was that the project, because of where it begins, sort of advances a false narrative that Black life begins at colonization, at chattel slavery, and then kind of continues through the violence of genocide. And here we could include thinking about indigenous life in the US context, genocidal intending policies through Jim Crow, racial segregation, and extralegal murder and lynching. And while Black and indigenous life does not indeed begin there, I think Professor Lyons makes very clear in the book that the encoding of the color line, with its benefits for some and its circumscribing and at times fatal detriments for Black, indigenous, and other marginalized and minoritized people in the US, not only had real material impact on lives, both positively and negatively, but was also sort of heartily maintained during US history and endures or persists, which is the word that Professor Lyons uses in the book in later chapters. There is a much welcomed, well, it was welcomed by me, end of the book. Where do we go from here and how do we get there? Although I might change the order of some of those things. I don't know if they were if you had listed them in the order of importance, but I might change the order of some. And I'm going to come back to that at the end. But I thought that list seemingly doable, completely actionable items, in my opinion. So I was very happy with the list at the end. So one of the things that I was thinking about in thinking about the book and the 1619 project and some of the critiques that were made of it was that one way to sort of counteract this idea that all of Black and indigenous life is mired in oppression, subjugation, and violence, while it is important, I want to say, and to a point that Lisa also made, to note that that as Professor Lyons says in the book, white supremacy in policy, in thought, and in practice absolutely requires violence in order to endure or persist. I was thinking about all of the things that I would pair the short chapters with to kind of get at some of the reality about the simultaneous persistence and endurance of world making that comes out of Black and indigenous traditions. And I think very much because of the structural confines that are in place, this world making could actually help a nation if it were interested in attacking the color line. And this is part of the conversation I want to have at some point today, is whether or not we are in a nation with a desire to attack the color line. I think to some of what Lisa has already said. So I was thinking about some archival artifacts in text and images, otherwise, that kind of get to the lived experiences and expressions of this other simultaneous world making that is happening, sometimes in spite of, sometimes despite the structural confines of the color line. And so I made a little list of some of those things that I thought could be great pairings, and then a list of things that I really appreciated that are happening in the short introduction. So I was thinking about, for example, Red Jacket's Seneca response to the Boston Missionary Society that requests permission to proselytize amongst the Iroquois in upstate New York, in northern New York State. in the early 1800s. I was thinking of Edward Curtis's images of indigenous life in the 19th century. And I know that Professor Lyons talks about the ghost dance in one of the chapter. And then some writings from young people at the carceral institutions that are the Indian boarding schools in the late 19th century. I was also thinking about Prince Hall and other enslaved people's petitions for freedom that really mobilize those modern ideas of natural rights in the aftermath of the war for American independence, and other narratives like that of Harriet Jacobs, Boston's own Maria Stewart in the early 19th century, and other work of Black and Indigenous life cultural productions in the 20th century. And here I was thinking about Annie Burton's book called Memories of Childhood Slavery Days, which I thought was actually something that kind of, it gets published in 1900, but it really traces her youth during the Civil War and Reconstruction period, and then her adulthood into Great Migration in the industrial North, and then back to Florida where she starts her own business, and is kind of a testament to building a life from domestic work to business ownership inside of the oppressive structures that are outlined in Professor Lyons's book. And I think her life also is a refusal in many cases to the pervasive images of formerly enslaved Black women that are inscribed by not only the policy, but also attitudinal white supremacy. And of course, I was thinking about Chinese, Japanese, Mexican primary sources and archival materials, also of hyphenated Chinese, Japanese, Mexican Americans who are referenced in the Closing the Door chapter. And so pairing each of the chapters with some archival materials that get to the lived experience and the material impact, but also the world making that's happening simultaneously. And certainly, as as I do in my classes, and I'm sure is probably true here in the law school as well, is a deep dive into the language of the Supreme Court cases that come through in each chapter, both the sort of majority and minority positions, to really understand and grapple with the ideologies, the assumptions, and in some cases, the contemporary science that's at work to uphold and bolster this problematic structure. So I want to give also a list of things that I really appreciated and then get to my questions. So one of the things I really appreciated was the very accessible and concise definition of racial capitalism. So this is one of the most accessible definitions I've seen. I mean, even my definition that I try to introduce at the beginning of courses takes 2 slides, a discussion of Cedric Robinson and Du Bois. Sometimes I have to like bring in Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And so I really appreciated this. I thought this was going to be incredibly useful for me, for my purposes anyway. And then because of the introduction of racial capitalism as a key term early on, I also appreciated the use of contemporary sort of business language in the early Virginia chapter to really make this clear. And that is one of the things that I focus on, that colonial project as being one that really is about business in many cases. And I think many students come to this early understanding with a sort of retrograde narrative about that project. I also appreciated the early attention to systematization and encoding in law and practice, the racialized labor system that becomes the institution of slavery and thus white supremacy and the color line that is created. And I think the ways that the laws and practices and ideas about Indigenous people then are kind of laid along this color line. And for me, this was especially important when I was teaching in California, for example, because the differences between racial hierarchies in the Anglo-colonial project versus the Spanish colonial project are really kind of important distinctions to make. And I found that students, don't often, this is not often kind of in the framework for how they're thinking about racialized and then racial ideas, and then the development of racial science, as it was called, that is cultivated to support this. I also appreciated the expansion of the often narrow events and people that we think about when we think about the modern civil rights movement in the Black Power era. So in chapters 18, 19, and 20, which means that I really appreciated the attention paid to the very diabolical targeting and impact of the FBI's counterintelligence program against movements besides, some civil rights organizations and Black Power organizations and activists, but also Red and Chicano Power, Women's Liberation Organization, anti-war activists, right? So I appreciated the expansion of that. I think students are often surprised that it was, well, one, that King was, being wiretapped, but that it was more than just the Black Panther Party. And then I appreciated the attention to language, and in that section in the beginning of the book that kind of talks about why you're going to use certain words, and then so much of how the book ends, certainly that last chapter. So because of those appreciations, there were then places that I wanted more precision in language, for one. So one of the early examples I saw was the use of words that in my subfield of Black studies and Black history are sort of rightly being challenged. So the word slave or master, or even ghetto, which in my work, I really grapple with the use of it because of all of the sort of pejorative meanings that comes with it, and then what it means for the lives of people in those urban spaces. And because I appreciated the attention to the construction of the color line and what it took over time to maintain it, I wish that in places where Professor Lyons gave examples of racial exploitation and racial subjugation, really to clarify the point that there were also examples of racial benefit, which is sort of the other end of the color line. And I think some of this is attended to in the more land and labor chapter, but I wanted, something in every chapter, the way that Bacon's Rebellion really laid that early groundwork in the early chapter. Because you say very clearly, for example, at the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction chapter, that, quote, America would continue to privilege what the dominant segments of society regarded as whiteness. And in another place earlier, you say that whiteness was a valuable property and unearned passport to the privilege of decent treatment, including respect for white people's legal rights. And so I found those incredibly important nuggets, and I wanted some of the examples to kind of contrast with the examples that were also in the chapter. I think this is some of what folks find the most difficult to grapple with, and I think speaks to questions around, what does future equity and reparations look like? As I already said, I really appreciated the expansion of the narrative of more than just King and the Montgomery bus boycott, for example, as the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. And I saw a missed opportunity to discuss an earlier interracial labor movement, which there is a little bit of in there, but I wanted more. And then I think a movement too by Black women for bodily integrity and autonomy. So I'm thinking about Rosa Parks in chapter 18 and kind of how she gets to that work that she does with the Women's Political Council and in Montgomery, and that, she, a decade earlier, she is an NAACP investigator who is looking into sexual assault and sexual violence against Black women sort of, throughout the South, and begins an important restorative justice campaign for Mrs. Reese Taylor, but that she is in that movement in the 40s. And then, we see her, and I appreciated too the discussion of her at Robert Williams's funeral. But I think this gives us an expanded view, not just temporally, but also in terms of goals and objectives in historical social movements in the US context, beyond or in some cases not at all about integration and desegregation. And I will come back to that in a couple of sentences. So my final point, I think, is about what I started calling yesterday, the generosity of intentions that Professor Lyons offers to the United States. And I'm happy to talk more about this, but I think I had this question about the role of reform in that last section, the where do we go from here and how do we get there? Because I felt like what is so clear is that there is a strong case. Professor Lyons lays out a strong case, even briefly, about the entrenchment and support structures of white supremacist thought, policies, and practices, and the impacts, both positively and negatively, and the seeming commitment to maintenance, and in some cases, enhancement, right, of the structure. And I think that what does not come through is really a willingness to shift this significantly. And I'm thinking here about number 4 in chapter 23 that says, which is the where do we go from here, how do we get there, which says history shows that current racial stratification results largely from public policies that are rationalized, reinforced, and maintained by white supremacist ideology. The color line persists despite campaigns for reform because it is deeply entrenched in the economy and in attitudes among whites that range from racial hatred to moral indifference. To weaken the color line, we must address the ideology of white supremacy as well as material inequities. And I'm wondering here about the despite campaigns to reform. My engagement in this history has led me to see these campaigns as less about reform and really more about expansion of democracies, right? So I'm thinking about those places where you talk about the pushback to these structures, and that the ideals of democracy, those early, sort of founding ideals of democracy were just that they were ideals, and they were always exclusionary and exclusive, and that historically marginalized and minoritized people then have sort of fought, right, over the course of these many centuries to expand these, to meet those ideals, while others have really worked to maintain that exclusiveness of rights, of privileges, et cetera. So I wonder about this term reform as a solution. And this might just be semantics, but I'm interested in talking about this. So I'll end with an appreciation for mentioning the Black Panther Party's survival pending revolution community programs that I think are examples not of reform, but of expanding access and meeting community needs when the state refuses. And I think these are lessons in living otherwise in sort of different configurations of life in the midst of these moments, and within this trajectory of a very deliberate structural oppression that the book really lays out. And in contrast to this deliberate structural oppression, there are these useful kind of universal experiences in surviving enclosure, in kind of determination to live otherwise despite and in spite of state attempts at repair, restoration, or reconstruction. I think instead they give us tools and vision for building new societal structures that are more based in justice. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Austin. Now we turn to Professor Gonzalez-Rose.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for allowing me to join you today. It is really a true honor. This has been so interesting, both reading the book and hearing the remarks today. Through the color line, a short introduction, David Lyons has offered a tremendous service to students and academics in the law, history, social sciences, humanities, and other fields by providing a concise history of the development and maintenance of race through the law, through public and private policies, and through societal and individual discrimination. He shows how race and racism were developed through these mechanisms in an effort to facilitate and maintain white supremacy. He indicates how law and policy acted to facilitate racism, thereby deflating that misguided notion that racism stems from merely a natural lack of familiarity, of solidarity, and due to preference between people who look different and who come from different ancestral backgrounds. A powerful example of this is how the slave codes and anti-fraternization laws in the South were implemented to defeat the powerful alliances between Black and white people who were subordinated and came together to rebel. For indentured white people and enslaved Black people at that time, common interests outweighed differences. However, the law was intentionally used to define and divide racialized groups for a purpose of entrenching power in the white elite. Lyons also wisely orients the history of race in the United States as a story of colonialism, and specifically how the method of colonizing was white settler colonialism. How white settlers stole the land of indigenous Americans and also Chicanos through occupation, use, the law, such as examples of the land grant cases, and through violence. Further, I applaud Lyons because he avoids the confines of what Juan Perea and Richard Delgado term the Black-white paradigm and integrates the racialized history of indigenous Americans, Latinx, Asian Americans, and others, instead of merely focusing on Black-white race relations, as is too often traditionally done in history books. He also aptly starts with exploration of conquest and of the discovery doctrine. He gives good coverage of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and subordination of mestizos. And in doing so, he shows us how racism in the United States began, not with a narrative just about slavery of Black persons, but with attacks on indigeneity. And in taking a more inclusive approach, he reveals connections between racialized groups. For instance, how slavery began with enslaving indigenous persons and then moved to a different, even more vicious program of enslavement of Black persons, and how the enslavement of Black people, which made cotton plantations possible, played a role in the forcible removal of Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, and other nations, leading to the tragic Trail of Tears from the areas called Georgia to Oklahoma. So there are many important lessons to be learned in these 128 pages. There's a lot that I would like to talk about and reflect upon, but because of the limited amount of time here, I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the broader framing and orientation of this small but impressive history book, and encourage us all to think about orienting ourselves as anti-racist scholars. And in the anti-racist scholar space, where I tend to spend the majority of my time, the culture there is to question ourselves, to question our work in the spirit of individual and collective growth, not just for criticism. So I'm proceeding with that spirit. Now, the theme of the book, the color line is unsurprisingly from the title, right? It's the color line. And the opening line of the book reflects this, stating, Americans generally see themselves and are seen by fellow Americans as white, Black, red, yellow, or brown. I am concerned about this statement and this framing for a few reasons. First, while Professor Lyons provides the historical account of how race and racism was a creation of law and policy, and then that developed into social and individual discrimination, at times it sometimes feels that the fact that race is a social and legal creation is a bit lost. There is a risk of conflating racial identity with racial stratification, whether that stratification is racial privilege or racial subordination. And so while it is true that forcing people of certain pan-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural backgrounds together into a racial classification and forcing them into a social legal strata and condition of oppression led to shared experiences and occupations of shared spaces. Identity and subordination remain really distinct concepts. Further, the racialization effect of becoming Black or brown is not the same as becoming white, as is occasionally intimated in the text. The former is to be initially subordinated as such, which may later be reclaimed as a point of pride. And the other is to be unjustifiably exalted and privileged, and then assumed to be race neutral. Second, while the terms Black, brown, and even to some extent red have been reclaimed and reimagined by the persons for whom those terms were thrust upon, the term yellow has not. It is still considered by many Asian Americans to be a pejorative term and even a racial slur, such as a controversy that was in the news back in November, where Sacramento's top health official referred to Asian Americans as yellow folks, in a conversation where he also spoke of Black, brown, and white folks. So the first line could make Asian American readers uncomfortable, and it could indicate a lack of sensitivity and decreased trust in the content ahead in the pages. And it could implicitly also give non-Asian Americans permission to use this term. As scholars committed to anti-racism, and after reading David Lyons' book, it certainly makes me feel that this is a commitment of his. I think we need to think carefully about our audience. Who is our audience? And how will they feel about these words, such as yellow, references to enslaved persons of African descent as immigrants, even if qualified by in chains? And what about the repeated use of the word ghetto to talk about predominantly Black urban neighborhoods, a word that conjures unfair racial stereotypes and suggests blame of and blame, suggests judgment of and blame on Black communities. Third, I applaud David Lyons for recognizing that white supremacy is sadly, as he explains, a founding pillar in the United States. Today, I'd also like to talk about some first cousins of white supremacy, which are white normativity and white transparency. Concepts I think that all of us involved in race and the law scholarship should think about. As Pat Williams explains, white normativity is the implicit belief that white ideas, practices, and experiences are inherently normal, natural, and right. As Barbara Flagg has said, white transparency is the tendency of whites not to think about whiteness or about norms, behaviors, experiences, or perspectives that are white specific. White transparency occurs, as Richard Delgado explains, the white point of view masquerades as colorless, raceless, and systematically devoid of bias. So how do we, as anti-racist scholars, keep white normativity and white transparency in check? And I really think that awareness is important to root it all out in its subtle forms. So returning to that opening line about Americans generally seeing themselves and being seen as different colors, including white, I wonder, and to what extent do white Americans actually see themselves as white? And how often do white people see themselves as the neutral, the norm, as raceless? This can pose white normativity and white transparency challenges requiring deepened awareness as scholars. And this can be challenging for even scholars of color because we have been implicitly trained and socialized in our respective disciplines to see the white experience as the norm and normal, to perform whiteness in our teaching and in our writing. So one method is to check ourselves and actively seek to write to a racially diverse audience and seek to use terminology that does not deter their readership and full engagement. Another is checking our assumptions about white as the baseline and interrupting typical traditional narratives that implicitly affirm this. So when we write about race, to view white people as also raced. So I just want to give an example of this and kind of go on a little journey of this sort of analysis. So in chapter 22, in discussing the persistence of the color line, racial segregation in housing takes center stage. We are asked to, quote, consider the residential segregation of African Americans in the urban North, which is so extreme, it is characterized by sociologists as hyper-segregation. That degree of segregation and its maintenance over time are unique in American history, something that has not been experienced by any other ethnic or immigrant group. The persistence of the Black urban ghetto appears to result from several factors, end quote, and it goes on to discuss legacies of racist policies that created racial inequity, such as the wealth gap. Now, I, of course, agree with much of this. The fact that the United States is as racially segregated as ever is deeply troubling. And understanding how Black segregation and racial isolation is different than white isolation in terms of true choice. And I agree that the result of this segregation is from past and present racist policies. But I want to deconstruct this a little bit to root out white normativity and to question the perpetual problematizing of Black neighborhoods and the lack of doing the same for white neighborhoods. So first of all, is it accurate that African Americans in the urban North are hyper-segregated or highly segregated? Now, there may be such segregation in Black neighborhoods in some instances, but it can also be that the traditional narrative is no longer accurate. Often these so-called Black neighborhoods actually have prominent numbers of Latinos, Latinxes, and increasing numbers of Asian Americans. Black people, Latinos, and Asian Americans living together, going to school together, this is diversity. In fact, it's a lot more diverse than most white Americans experience in their neighborhoods and schools. Now, there might not be hyper-segregation at all. And even when there is racial isolation and segregation, that racial isolation itself, that isn't the problem. The problem is that racist policies, historical and modern, such as real estate redlining, both de jure on the books and de facto, inadequate investments in schools, inadequate housing, barriers to employment, lack of jobs, employment discrimination, deficient public transportation, food deserts, lack of affordable good health care, really the lack of adequate remediation for past and continuing discrimination, these are the problems. So also let's question, are African Americans in the urban North actually the most segregated? As a Brookings Institution report from March 2020 reports, even as metropolitan areas diversify, white Americans still live in mostly white neighborhoods. From 2014 to 2018, in the 100 top metropolitan areas in terms of size, the population size, the average white person lived in a neighborhood that was nearly 3/4 white, while the average Black person lived in a neighborhood that was only 45% Black. So actually there are a lot more white Americans who are segregated, who live segregated lives, whose studies indicate prefer to do so and choose to do so. The majority of people in the United States who are highly segregated are white Americans. So why aren't white Americans considered an ethnic group? Is this because whites are perceived as not raced? because they're the control group, because they're the baseline, or because the idea that white segregation cannot be problematized in any way. But why isn't white segregation problematized? What about deficits and problems of living in an all-white environment when the United States is actually a diverse country? What about the lack of exposure to diverse languages and cultures? Might this foster intolerance? Might this foster attraction to bizarre conspiracy theories? What about the inability to communicate and understand linguistic difference, including diverse accents? What about gun violence in white communities? What about radicalizing into domestic terror groups, which the Department of Homeland Security has identified as very problematic, with white supremacist domestic terrorist groups being the greatest terror threat to the United States? Now, I'm not at all saying that any racialized group of people is more problematic than another, but why is it that Black communities are always problematized? Just wrapping up here, I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not actually even interested in asking what is wrong with communities, whether they're Black or brown or white. Rather, as an anti-racist scholar, I'm interested in asking what is wrong with policies. Policies are the way that racism is maintained in today's society, and it's also a way that racial equity can be increased. So I hope that many people read David Lyons' fantastic book, The Color Line, with an eye to how law and policies throughout history in the United States have perpetuated racial subordination with the goal of facilitating white supremacy. I hope that they observe some similarities between the racist policies of the past and what we're experiencing today, and start thinking even more deeply about how law and policy can be changed to increase racial equity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gonzalez-Rose. And now we turn to our author, David Lyons, for his responsive remarks. And we have no questions in the Q&A yet, so we should have time for a couple. So if people want to write their questions into the Q&A, that would be great.
Well, it's hard for me to think as quickly as I'd like in response to the various comments that have been made. And I'll focus on a couple. I'll focus on those that were most critical, I think it's fair to say, of the book, either in what it said or what it fails to say. Two issues that stand out among those that were raised are the use of language, especially the use of color line language. But not just that, not just the terms that are used to identify people as white and Black and so on, but also terms such as ghetto. I think it's fair to say that I was not sensitive enough to the points that have been made by the commentators in thinking about this language, to the impact and to the significance of the terms that were used. And this is brought out especially by Professor Gonzalez-Rose in talking about who the audience is and who might be disturbed, reasonably offended by the use of language in the book. And that's something I take seriously. If there's an opportunity to revisit this text, that is to revise it, if it ever goes into another edition, I'm certainly going to take these suggestions and these criticisms very seriously. And I'd like to consult with the commentators further on this. Another point that was made, especially by the last commentator, I think is very interesting. And it's an issue that I admittedly don't take into account in any way in the book, and that is as she puts it, the problematizing majority Black or predominantly or significantly Black neighborhoods versus white neighborhoods, where, as a matter of fact, self-segregation or segregation of whites and the exclusion of people of color from white neighborhoods deliberately is, in fact, the most serious problem in residential segregation. I have not been aware of the increased diversity of non-white neighborhoods that Professor Gonzalez Rose pointed out, and that's something that also would have to be taken very seriously. I'll say a couple of other things and then we'll leave a bit of time for comments. The last chapter discussing reforms, possible reforms, could have been presented differently in terms of reparations. I have a very broad conception of reparations as that of repairing wrongdoing or repairing the consequences of wrongdoing. And much of what's in that list of actions which could be taken can be thought of in terms of reparations in those terms, in that broader sense. I've also discussed this issue more extensively in an essay on reparations. I think that's all that I could reasonably say now on such short reflection about the comments, except just to express thanks for them.
Okay, great. Well, we do have a couple of questions from the participants. So a two-part question from Sterling Harwood. Is Professor Lyons optimistic about a future likely to include automation, including driverless vehicles instead of the labor for drivers, and including space exploration or colonization? Or do you think the color line will follow us into this technological future?
Shall I respond?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a couple more after this. We have about 6 minutes left, so let's.
I'll be very brief. I think as things now stand, the color line is going to follow us. Any technological development is bound to be affected by the existing color line, which hasn't disappeared, which is facing a period of re-intensification that we saw in the period following Obama's presidency. Yeah, it's a problem. It's not going away.
Great. Okay, we have the next one is more in the nature of a comment. Professor Austin, this is from Linda McLean. Professor Austin, your model of pairing the color line with examples of the persistence of efforts at world making reminds me of a report released last week, Education for American Democracy. The report spoke of reflective patriotism and grappling with hard histories, while also recognizing human agency social movements despite subordination.
I'm going to take a look at that link.
Okay, great. Now from David Sipe. Thank you all for a very interesting discussion about a book that I should certainly read. And it's short, though it sounds like it has a lot of chapters. I wonder how moral philosophers are presently thinking about racial preconceptions in the tradition of Western philosophy as a white baseline of experience, or what Professor Gonzalez Rose has just described as white transparency. I guess that's for everybody who wants to take a stab at that.
Perhaps Lisa should try. Professor Rivera.
She's not coming back on. Okay.
I'm here. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I was just like trying to For a sec. Oh, I was just quickly going to say, I think I may have been reading it slightly differently because I think I sort of took it that in a sense it really interrogates the book. I mean, the sort of story in the book, it does look at white experience, but in the sense that it has the reason for the color line itself is to advantage whites. So I mean, I in terms of, oh sorry, I'm sorry, my internet's connection's unstable again, but so the whole point of the color line is to advantage whites. So in a sense, I think maybe the book is, it's very hard not to center whites in that story. I'm sorry, did I break up? I couldn't
No, we
tell.
heard that. Does anyone else have anything they want to say in response to that? Okay, so I had a question. I had a general question about the interaction between philosophy and history also, and I wonder, David, I guess maybe this is to you. I mean, do you consider this a work of philosophy, or is this a work of history?
It's unquestionably a work of history. Very little original history. There's some tying pieces together in constructing it, but it's very much dependent upon the work of historians and an attempt to synthesize that and also widen the scope, because there's only one other book that I know of that has this scope of chronologically and sociologically. It's a work of history.
Unless anyone has any final words, I think we can wrap up. And again, I want to thank our panelists and also thank David for his book that gave us the opportunity to come together today. And thank David Weber for organizing. And thank all you participants for attending. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you again in some other forum. I see there's more questions, but aren't we at time? I believe it's 1:59, so I think we're 2 o'clock is the ending, right, David Weber? Okay. Well, we're gonna yes. Okay. So we're sorry, but David Lyons can see the questions that came up afterwards, or all the panelists can. So thank you. Sorry we couldn't get to them, but thank you all very much, and we hope to see everybody again in another forum like this. Okay. Have a nice rest of your day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.